Good afternoon. I hope you did well on test one. So what we're looking into now is the War for Independence. And I wanted to begin with the context. Okay, I don't do that too often in preceding my argumentative write-ups, but I felt like that which I give in the introduction is vital to understand, in that you have different historical interpretations to the War for Independence, as you do on any topic, but the data that I put in that intro seems to be very popularly embraced, very broadly used from a broad swath of interpretations. All right. So for one, we're going to look into court history and the claim of American exceptionalism, that you could easily guess that we were fighting against tyranny, that we were fighting for liberty, that we were fighting for consent of the governed and natural rights of all human beings. All right. And then we're going to look at the common interpretation in England itself, known as the salutary neglect thesis. We're going to look at that thesis as well and their interpretation of things. We're going to look at a very conflict history oriented take by Howard Zinn, and contending that everything was about power and just power dynamics. All right. So we'll look into that, see what you think. So to begin with, I don't know if you've had a chance to read the introduction, but what I very often find to be relevant context to the War for Independence are the, I start off with demographic boom. There was a great demographic boom, supposedly from the 1750s to the 1770s. Our population here increased by almost 1 million, just over 1 million to 2 million. That's incredible, especially for that time period. And there are quotes from primary sources that the cities were not prepared for that type of pressure, with, garbage disposal, crime, etc. And so you have that issue. You also have the issue of a lot of Americans in the 1750s, etc., moving from the cities to the periphery, out to the western frontiers, all right, into the hinterland. And what oftentimes accompanied that exodus were demands, because what they would find out is that they were incurring a lot of the costs of being a subject to Great Britain, without a lot of the benefits. They were very poorly represented. They almost never voted anybody of their own into the assemblies, the elected bodies in each of the colonies. And so you had friction between ambitious, largely white Americans going into the frontier areas and those living in the cities. So you had those frictions as well. Howard Zinn covers them well. Then you also have, so how does that tie in? It's just the simple thesis is that Great Britain in 1763 fought a war against France, known as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. Same thing, 7 Years' War, it was known in Europe, French and Indian here on North American soil. The French decided to move eastwardly to secure the Detroit and Pittsburgh areas of present day, they called it the old Midwest in the Great Lakes area. And they were given an ultimatum by the English, because they knew that the English were showing signs that they were going to embrace westward expansion. And they were trying to hold on to and secure their southern base of Canada. So at any rate, Lord Dunmore sends men, including George Washington, on a supposedly diplomatic but deterrence-oriented mission to try to scare the French and to warn them not to build their forts any closer to the English colonies along the coast in toward the Appalachians. And an altercation ensued. A high-ranking French gentleman lost his life, and it escalated into war between England and France. So during that French and Indian War, you had the known fact that the British began by ordering the elected assemblies in each of the American colonies, North American ones, to requisition a certain amount of funds for the war effort, and to raise a certain number of volunteers to fight with the British Redcoats against the French. All right. Now, according to Paul Johnson in his history book, Howard Zinn as well, and other historians like Gary Nash, they contend that the colonies to the number, each one of them, all 13, none of them raised what was asked of them by the British government. Not enough funds and not enough men. So then there grew frustration, especially when the war didn't bode so well for Great Britain at certain points. And so they gave power, increasing power, to a certain gentleman, and he began to be supported by the Tories, the Conservative Party back in England, back in Parliament. And the Tories were increasingly believing that the Americans were not pulling their weight, their fair share of the responsibility of fighting this war. Because, of course, their simple justification for that rationale was that they believed that the Americans were only there by the generosity of certain English kings and queens, and that they were entitled to a much freer government and also to more economic opportunities under the British than they would have had under the French. And that's argumentative, but that was their argument, right? So they're saying, right, that it is in your Americans' best interest that we beat the French and that you remain under the British flag instead of the French. And a lot of evidence exists in primary sources that many Americans didn't see it that way. They saw it as a war between two imperialist giants fighting it out for domination of North America. So, like I said, there's evidence that we didn't do what was expected of us. So at any rate, at the end of the war, the British are going to win. So they're going to gain domination over North America and sovereignty over it, Canada and the American 13 colonies. And now you have these demographic issues. So there was a practical element to this. If you look at a PBS video on the War for Independence, you get the impression that a lot of those in Parliament who began taxing us at the end of this war and began kind of cracking down on smuggling and other violations of the mercantilist restrictions, that they felt that it was a practical matter, that many of them were not trying to incite Americans, not trying to provoke Americans, not trying to oppress Americans, but it was a very much more practical than that, that they had just won an unwieldy, large empire, and they're dealing with a burgeoning population, mass migration to different areas. And so they need to administratively gain a greater, more efficient, effective hold over the North American continent. And so hence what Americans derisively called like a crackdown on us in 1763 as the French and Indian War ends and the British prevail. So that oftentimes is seen as context to why things happen the way they did. All right. Then you also have the fact that there was ambiguity regarding citizenship and what citizenship rights entail. You see, England garnered just as much from Rome, historically and traditionally, as they did from the Germanic tribes, like the Angles and the Saxons. And so with Rome, right, there were at least 3 different levels of citizenship. You had the basic freedom to basic economic freedom was kind of the base minimum of citizenship. Be able to buy, rent, start your own business, be paid or remunerated for your labor, etc. Right? Then you had a second level. Towns were grabbing this back in Europe through charters with Parliament and with the kings and queens. And that second level entailed political equality when it came to basically criminal defense and law, that the certain rights that were assumed to be inherent in citizenship under England, that those were to be protected as a citizen. You could take people to court, namely, and fight for your rights judicially and be protected under English common law. But then thirdly, you have the level of suffrage. And the level of suffrage, right, states that you are allowed to participate in government. You could vote, you could run for office, etc. All right. So the English, they did not have this ambiguity. I think is pretty big, and it needs to be addressed in almost any interpretation that you have on the War for Independence. Is that the English did not have a singular written document like we're accustomed to with the 1787 Constitution. And so everything was to be organic, like a growing, living organism. You have laws that were made by Parliament, but sometimes they abrogated past laws and did just the opposite, and they were able to undo those. So that was subject to change. You had royal decrees, which could be instituted by kings and queens, and they began to have to balance power with Parliament and their laws and could no longer do as they pleased with these royal edicts. And then you had court decisions that were to establish precedents that we're accustomed to today in America. But of course, as in America, precedents could be overturned by subsequent generations and later judges and make just the opposite stance on a given issue. So all of that amalgamated together supposedly informed everyone under Great Britain of what their rights were as subjects, because that's the term they used. They didn't use the term citizen yet. So the rights of subjectship, it was murky even if you were considered a subject, right? How much more murky when they're not clear if you're a subject or not. So you had famous cases. You had cases of very shortly after I think it was like 1707, the Union of Northern Ireland, Scotland, and England together as Great Britain. Someone who was Scottish fought for his rights in courts, in the court of law, and stated that he was born after the 1707 Union of England and Scotland, and so therefore he was a British subject, even though he was a Scot, and he won. And so they declared in that case, right, that it was place of birth, jus soli, that determined citizenship. All right. But then with the development of colonies overseas, they began having people contend, hey, wait a minute, my father is an English subject back in England proper, and I come from his lineage, from his blood, and therefore I want the rights of an Englishman myself. And so that was jus sanguinis, and that was decided in a particular court case, more than one, so that the status, the legal status of a child depended upon the status of the dad, regardless of where the child was. But then when it came to the English colonies, you had different crowns, right? You had James I with Jamestown in Virginia. Then you had Charles I, the guy who would end up losing his head, literally, in the English Civil War in 1649. him granting the New England colonies and other colonies. And then later, like with Pennsylvania, you have Charles II after the Puritan rule failed in England. And so they all had different personalities. They were all living in a different context. They all had different philosophical takes on what a king did and did not have a right to dictate, right? And so not all of them made it explicitly clear in the paperwork with the original charters sanctioned in the colonies about what really constituted the rights of these colonists coming here. So you had exceptions. For instance, as you may recall, in the New England colonies, you see here, it was approved and written. You shall enjoy, well, shoot, our names are covering it, all the liberties and immunities of the free and natural subject as if born within the realm of England. That was pretty explicit. So in later Massachusetts, when it was no longer Massachusetts Bay, as well as Plymouth, when it was combined as Massachusetts, they were very clear. The children were taught that, and people took it as an axiom that you don't question. Yes, in our original charter, we enjoy all the rights of subjects as if we're living in England itself, period, right? And then also in Maryland, do you see here? See here, the Carolinas, Maryland. So where is it? This one, sorry, I don't have the exact quote on this one, but you see it right there. They were to enjoy the rights of Englishmen who came to Maryland. So it was explicit in a few colonies, but not the others, right? And so, at any rate, going back to the handout, that's something also to be considered, is because those back in Parliament, right, are going to contend, first of all, no, you guys are colonists, period. You're not English subjects, right? And then even those who did agree that, okay, based upon a few explicit, statements and in 3 or 4 original charters, we'll grant you that you've been granted by previous kings the right of subjectship. What exactly level of subjectship do we afford you? Because clearly we can, and we often do, at least psychologically and culturally, and we have historically treated you as different from the rest of us. So for instance, back in Parliament itself, they had boroughs. Boroughs were districts, right? Like congressional districts, whereby in that borough, they were to have a general election, and they were to elect someone into the House of Commons, the lower house of Parliament. The House of Lords was still based on aristocracy, and it was just people with the right names and the right connections could join the House of Lords in the upper house. But with the lower house, right, no one established or recognized any boroughs in the 13 colonies. So they claimed that they were virtually representing us as colonists. But as you'll see, we developed the outcry that we demanded to be actually, right, literally represented by being able to go to a poll, cast a vote, and actually send one of our own as our elected representative to Parliament. Well, that never happens, right, throughout all this. And so that's important to remember, all right? And then again, if they do agree of subjectship, like I said, do they go to the extreme of suffrage? And a lot of people, especially in the Tory party, were not willing to go that far, that the colonists should be entitled to that final highest level of citizenship. And by the way, the whole argument for virtual representation was pretty simple, is that they did it by demographic. They argued that if you're a poor sharecropping farmer who farms on someone else's property, rents it, but is able to establish a certain ratio of the yield when the crop revenue comes in, and then that pays for your rent, and it gives you additional money, etc. Right? If there are any sharecroppers in the House of Commons, then you're represented, whether you live in Sussex, Essex, whatever part of England, or back in the colonies, in any of the 13 colonies. And likewise, if you're an artisan or a skilled worker, if there are artisans in Parliament, then you are virtually represented, even though they're 3,000 miles across an ocean, living in various parts of England proper of itself. So we did not buy, when you look at our political leaders, our population at that time, we did not buy that argument. That was not sufficient to the Geist, the spirit of that American generation. They weren't accepting that. They wanted more literal representation. All right. So then, in addition to that, you also have, this is another part of internal squabbles. You had slave rebellions, also threats of a lot more slave rebellions. You had Western periphery, as I already mentioned, petitions, and even sometimes they raised militias in threatening to fight the established militia of their own colony because they were not fully represented in the government that was stationed on the East Coast of their colony. You had occasions of merchants hoarding bread and food until they could get such a high demand and outcry for the food that then they could sell it at whatever price they wanted, and they would skyrocket the price. And people thought that that was very immoral and unscrupulous and unfair. So you had literally several bread riots. So you had lots of things that were going on. We were not some unilateral, monolithic group of everybody being the same, everyone on the same page as far as what we thought our rights were and what our agendas were. We were various demographics, right? Remember, demographic is just a category of the population. So ethnic demographics, socioeconomic demographics, regional demographics, age demographics, etc. And then not to mention ideological demographics, people having different opinions, different worldviews and platforms, political platforms. So at any rate, we had the regulator movement in the Carolinas that actually went to a battle. These are North Carolinians fighting North Carolinians. All right, so we had, that might be something to look into and see. Also, with the burgeoning economy and the burgeoning population, you saw a much more apparent discrepancy in wealth. In the primary sources, beginning in the 1740s, you get a lot of complaints and concerns about small, elite, rich groups of people in Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York City, etc., who kind of ostentatiously flaunted their wealth. And there was a lot of public outrage against that they were trying to literally, belittle and denigrate and provoke the poor. When you look at almshouses and those who are without employment and desperately coming to these almshouses to get free food and board and to try to learn a trade so they can economically get on their feet, the almshouses just absolutely exploded in number in the mid 1700s. So you have a problem of rich and poor, obviously, that was exacerbated, made worse by the growth of population and also the increasing commercialization of the merchants from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, who were getting luxury goods from around the world that only the rich could afford. So those might all be something to consider when you look into this. And then also, I have it here somewhere, but regardless of what you think of its importance, of their importance, plural, there were some ideological movements at this time, about beliefs, philosophical, political, religious, that, just time-wise alone, they're happening. So for one was the French Enlightenment that began to take off in the mid 1740s. Then you had the Scottish libertarian movement, or known as the opposition back in England, the liberal opposition. And then you also had the First Great Awakening, and those might have had something to do with increasing, changing, raising the expectations that the colonists had as far as what they felt entitled to and what they didn't. All right. So at any rate, you look at all that, and now you could begin the basic narrative. But also, bear with me. Where's my 1776 PowerPoint? All right. So I'm going to wait for that because that's number one, except for the very bottom. At the end of the war, the British were 137 million shillings in debt from the French and Indian War, and their annual budget was only 8 million. So that was going to take some time and effort to pull themselves out of the red, right? So at any rate, George III takes the throne. His grandfather was the first of this new family dynasty, and his grandfather could scarcely speak English. He was German. And so there were some issues that his grandfather especially, but he and his father as well, had to face in being seen as a foreign German lord of the state. Okay. But he says here, let's see here. What do I want to get into on this one? Just yet. Almost nothing yet. All right. The Proclamation of 1763. Now note, oftentimes when you saw someone burnt in effigy, like a mannequin of someone, and they were hanging it from a tree and burning it, oftentimes it was George III, the King of England. But this give and take, this action and reaction sequence or narrative that we're about to get into, this was between our assemblies, our elected assemblies, and Parliament back in England, not the king. Okay, so at least technically they were being passed by Parliament, not George III. So the Proclamation of 1763 told Americans they could no longer cross the Appalachians, that those were open to the Native Americans. And there was anger because there was a sense of hypocrisy, because a lot of well-connected Englishmen were making lucrative profits from trading in furs and other commodities with the Native American tribes. And remember, to a lot of people, heading west across the Appalachians was their next best chance to realize the American dream, even though it was far from being called that at the time. The fancy word is socioeconomic ascension or mobility, moving up socially and economically up the pyramid. So if you didn't have something, it was seen as a safety valve, right? To get off the East Coast and to head west and try again. So now it seems like that was being cut off. Then the Sugar Act of 1764, it put a tax on sugar as well as other commodities directly onto the colonies that were importing them. Okay. And notice they did not ask our elected assemblymen for their consent. Okay. Parliament is directly taxing us now. And yes, that was pretty novel. That was pretty new. Notice, as I've sat under a very wise professor years ago, he said, by no means were these taxes onerous. They were not burdensome. They did not break the bank. Oftentimes they were like a half a pence, like not even a penny. But what the Americans are going to contend is it's the principle, and we're going to get back to it. So notice that they not only directly put a tax on sugar, but then they ordered the customs officials to return to their post. Such was the reputation for the customs officials not to even be at their posts, much less doing their jobs. They were the highway patrolmen to carry out and enforce the navigation laws. And the navigation laws were the mercantilist restrictions. You had to have the proper paperwork, the signature of the proper politician to be able to trade the commodity you were trading. They even could dictate what ports you could come from and to. Sometimes it became downright silly, whereby they would make you travel 3,000 miles back up to the English Isles just to get taxed, and then bring it all the way back down just to the Caribbean right by us. And so to a lot of people, it seemed an infringement of the merchants, quest for economic mobility, and an infringement upon their kind of natural right to do their thing economically, but also it seemed unnecessary, even ridiculous to some here. So at any rate, the Vice Admiralty courts, their jurisdictions were extended, and the English Navy was granted a new general writ, right? With the general writ, now they could stop anyone without cause, basically. So what we're accustomed to with the Fourth Amendment, right? That they have to have reasonable, concerns and show reasonable evidence to be able to get permission from a local court or judge to go and try something, or a police officer pulling someone over, getting into the trunk, etc. We have what we're familiar with as a Fourth Amendment, or right to privacy from unreasonable searches and seizures. We don't have that yet, but it seems as if there was a general expectation of that from the rebellion that arose to this. It was definitely seen as an infringement upon our rights, our individual rights. So they were granted that. So notice they're kind of cracking down. The specifically stated goods, enumerated goods, were broadened. So hides, iron, timber, etc. also were directly, specifically taxed by Parliament without our permission of our elected reps in the assemblies. New customs duties were put on foreign cloth, sugar, indigo, coffee, wine. Okay. And so what happens? 8 colonial assemblies petition and contend that they are undergoing economic injury. Okay. So notice they keep it a practical issue. Smuggling, however, New York smugglers paraded informer George Spencer with human feces upon him and forced him to leave. The Newport Mercury ship, sword fight, and colonial death. You also are going to have the Gaspé Affair, which won't be long from here. And the Gaspé Affair, they were in they were from Rhode Island, and they were out at sea, and the British ordered them to stop and allow the British to come aboard to check if they had the proper papers and see what they were selling and all that. And they refused. And so the British ship fired upon them, and they had an actual like mini naval battle in this Gaspé Affair. So things became quickly confrontational. All right. And then the Currency Act, this didn't happen too often, but sometimes the colonies tried to just simply, because there were literally, some of the colonies at this time were still on a barter system, especially down through the Appalachians in the present day Tennessee and Kentucky, which were just territories at that time. And so some states tried to create their own currency. And of course, Parliament cracked down on that. So then the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, again, it did not hit a broad demographic of people. It really didn't. It was any printed paper that you purchased. So oftentimes it was like the lawyers, especially, were hard hit. The owners of establishments who had to do proper paperwork. etc. So like the entrepreneurial class of business owners, they were hit hard by it. But nevertheless, it elicited a very violent response, a rebellious response from Americans. And what's interesting is Colonel Isaac Barr. He had spent some time living and working in America, but he was an Englishman, and he was back in English Parliament. And someone rose and said basically that, you know, we have they likened the American colonists to their child, saying that they had suckled them when they were young, provided the funds needed for them to get on their feet over in America, and they need not complain about Parliament taxing them. Isaac Barr tells them, basically, this is paraphrase, basically, I assure you, the Americans don't see it that way. The Americans feel as if they have taken this land from the Native Americans by grit and violence, and much travails, and they feel like they've done it all themselves, and they don't feel like they owe you anything, and they're going to continue to resent Parliament taxing them, and that seemed to be correct, more accurate to the truth. So then in the Virginia Assembly, or House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry was a young man, and that's when he says, give me liberty or give me death. Stands up and says that, this tyrant had his end, that tyrant had his end. Charles I, right, was beheaded. And he says George III basically is going to be next if he continues along these lines. And someone yells that that's treason. And he got quiet at that point. But he became kind of a rabble rouser there in Virginia. Notice Rhode Island did not meet with other assemblies of other states. Rhode Island kind of did its own thing. Some people kind of silly fashion call it Rogue Island. But their own assembly declared the Stamp Act unconstitutional and said they would not collect it. They would not force anybody to pay for it. And then Mr. Hutchinson was a well-connected aristocrat, an Englishman, and he had been handpicked as the Massachusetts governor. And he was no longer governor, and he went back kind of to his military roots. And of course, he was still quite prestigious and had a lot of connections. Well, he wrote to the present new governor, Bernard, and he said, I understand that we as Englishmen are proud of recognizing certain freedoms to our subjects, even those who are colonists abroad. He said, but before this gets out of hand, we need to use a suppressive hand. We need to basically stomp down on this rebellious sentiment and movement now before it gets out of hand. And he said, it's the ends justify the means. He said that when this movement dies down and we have peace again, it will have been worth depriving the subjects of Massachusetts of some of their rights for a short period of time. Somehow Benjamin Franklin got his hands on that letter and he gave it to the press, and the press went wild with it. And they're saying, right, that ex-Governor Hutchinson is telling the new governor to shed Americans' blood, to crack down on us because we're unhappy about these taxes. So that a growing sense of alienation. Okay. And then 9 states had their assemblymen meet together, and they agreed that they would not now nor in the future agree to pay or collect any tax except that had been okayed first by them, the assemblymen, known as the Stamp Act Congress. Then at that time, you had these extra legal institutions or groups that arose, and people like Gordon S. Wood, he thought this was huge, that this was showing the popularity of the American cause, that this truly was somewhat revolutionary, etc. So he really tries to emphasize the blue collar nature, right, of just regular uneducated workers, not connected to government in any way, joining the Sons of Liberty chapters and other groups like it. And what they began to do is they began to literally physically attack the customs officials, the tax collectors of the English that were trying to collect these taxes and try to intimidate them. They and the Daughters of Liberty, led by women, engaged in boycotts, and the boycotts supposedly on more than one occasion worked pretty well in getting, at least for the moment, Parliament to step down. And you could easily guess what they boycotted. They boycotted anything that Parliament taxed, right? And told Americans they better not buy it and make the merchants lose that money, sit on those goods. So sure enough, from all this, Parliament decides to step down to kind of back up. They dropped the taxes, but they issued the Declaratory Act and saying that, let it be clear, if it wasn't clear before, you are virtually represented by Parliament, and we have sovereignty over you. We have authority over you. All right. So then a little bit of time elapses, and Townshend was seen as a moderate. He and many of the Liberal Party members were known as the Whigs, WHIGS, were sympathetic to our plight and our cause, and said that, well, according to English common law, they have acquired, these rights, and we need not shed the blood of our American cousins, was a popular phrase, because literally a lot of them were related to people here, because the population was so much more WASP, like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant at that time on the East Coast. So what happens is he says, well, I'm not going to try a Stamp Act anymore, because that goes right inside the towns, goes within the colonies of any paper products. I'm not being that controversial. I'm just going to put an external tax just on the coast for the merchants to have to pay. And then they don't have to tax the people once they sell the commodities in. But we knew what would happen is they would compensate the merchants would, for having to pay that tax on these goods by raising the prices of those goods. So the common American consumer was now having to pay more. So they did it on lead, paint, glass, tea, etc. And at that time, it didn't take long for them to see that trouble was brewing from even this. So they sent troops to the coastal cities from the Great Lakes region. And at this time, right, this is going to lead to like the Boston Massacre, whereby they sent in, just in a single week, they sent in like 16,000 British redcoats into Boston. And Boston was not that big at the time. So, walking up and down the streets in the neighborhoods, etc. Then they set up vice admiralty courts in Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston. Now, the vice admiralty courts, if I haven't conveyed already, they were like the way that our present generation sees Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. It's like a place where civil law does not reside, and it's all military or martial law. And the rights you have civilly, right? If you were suspended under martial law, you don't have those rights necessarily. They could shoot first and ask questions later under martial law. And so the idea of being, subpoenaed or indicted for smuggling, it's one thing to have to go to a civil court and have a trial of peers decide on your guilt or innocence. Well, the British quickly decided there would be no justice in that colonists would allow fellow colonists off the hook. So they decided that the Navy, the military, was going to try these suspects. And a lot of people think that they did it in Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston, because first of all, those are the major port cities where smuggling was so rampant. But secondly, to make a statement, to try to kind of scare us, deter us from smuggling by putting people on trial under the military, right under the eyes of everybody else. So at any rate, they took John Hancock's ship. And at this time, Sam Adams sent a circular to all the colonies. And what he asked is that they be concerted in effort and in sentiment, that the assemblies of all 13 colonies would be apprised, first of all, immediately what was going on in each of the other colonies. And that if one of the colonies was suffering from a deprivation of their rights, if the British political system and leaders or the British armed forces began to crack down on any of them, the other ones would come to its assistance. So this is huge, right? Ensuring unity, a unified stand by the colonists. And so they were ordered back inside the assembly in Boston, the assemblymen, and they were ordered to revoke that circular of Sam Adams. And I kid you not, as they were doing the vote, there were British soldiers in the building with their guns trying to intimidate them, telling them that they better rescind it. Well, they did not. In a vote 92-17, 92 of them stated, we're sticking with the circular. We're going to unite with the other colonies. So when that happened, right, they dissolved the British governor and his handpicked royal council and the armed forces that were all in Boston under England or Great Britain. They declared the elected assembly dissolved. All right. And that's going to begin happening in one colony after another. And remember, that's our voice. That's our state level, or at this time, colonial level, elected reps. They're our voice. And now they're being dissolved punitively. Okay. So New York, they were dissolved over the Mutiny Act. The Mutiny Act stated that the British soldiers could come in and commandeer any products they needed from a colonist common house. So imagine a soldier from England coming to your door and he wants something from, I'm being silly here, but from your refrigerator. Okay. Or he wants a blanket or this and that. They could just take it now. So New York refused, and they were punitively dissolved by the governor there and the British authorities there. So now things are really getting polarized, right? One side against another. So the duties were repealed by the new prime minister, Lord North, except that on tea. And you can easily guess that this is connected to the Boston Tea Party. They kept one tea directly imposed on us from Parliament. One tax. And for whatever reasons, they did it on tea, okay, as a symbol of their authority. So then you had the Boston Massacre. A young American teenager got in a fight with a young English soldier who was stationed in Boston, and the English soldiers were paid so poorly that when they were stationed and furloughed for a while at a given location internationally, they would try to get a side job to supplement their money. So they fought over the same job at a rope making factory. Now, I'm not sure who got the job. I would imagine the Brit did. But they got in a fist fight over it. And the American got the better of him, and he returned to his garrison. The men were furious, and they went through the streets of Boston looking for him for vengeance. Well, he knew at that time that the leader of the English regulars, soldiers in Boston, was known for his leniency and his fairness toward the American colonists. So what he tried to do is he tried to literally run to the leader, who would, of course, he was hoping would talk his soldiers down from hurting him. And his name was Preston Brooks. And he's trying to tell Preston Brooks what's going on. Brooks is trying to figure out what the situation is. And as they're talking and the soldiers come back and they're angry and they want a piece of the kid and all that, instinctively, a crowd of regular colonists surrounds them saying, "What's going on here? What are you doing to that poor young man?" And they began taunting them. I guess they threw snowballs and stones at them. And nobody knows. Preston Brooks swore to his dying day that he never did. But the propagandist of the American War for Independence stated that Preston Brooks finally gave the okay for his men to shoot a volley into the crowd. And they killed a handful of people. So that's when pamphlets took off and people started like, writing all these pamphlets. And of course, the most famous one is by Thomas Paine. It's called Common Sense, and it's pretty aptly named. He states that he tries to get Americans to philosophically try to lose their deference for Mother England. And remember, deference is obediently knowing your place, being compliant, being obedient, not questioning your superiors. He clearly was trying to eradicate that deference. So he says in the book, it's only like 35 pages, like, what is the first king anyway? But the brute with the biggest club who beat over all the others into submission and declared himself the king. And how idiotic is it, he said, to have an inherited throne? How many times has human history shown us that could have a great leader and he has nothing but idiot sons and daughters to follow him? And then he says, economically, why do we need to pay these taxes and let England and Britain, run away with the lion's share of the profits when we are a much bigger country with much more resources, much more economically affluent and blessed? They need us more than we need them. And the arguments run like that in his pamphlet. So you have that. And then now you have established in 1772 the Committees of Correspondence, and they were that was a result of that circular that I mentioned. These were a group of men who literally sent correspondence to the assemblymen of all the colonies, letting them know what was going on in which colony, who was being deprived of what right, where the fight was at that moment, etc. And note, right, some of these assemblies began meeting in taverns and bars and these other informal locales because they had been dissolved by the English government, right? But that did not deter them. That did not stop them from meeting and trying to make decisions on behalf of the colonists in hiding, all right? And then to add to that symbolic tea tax, the English East India Company was going bankrupt, and there were connections involved. So a lot of it was just kind of nepotism, just favoritism with family and friends, trying to help them out economically. Only the English East India Company could sell tea to us, and it was taxed by Parliament without our consent. So on December 16th of 1773, the Sons of Liberty chapter, dressed and disguised as Native Americans, came out onto the pier and dumped 10,000 shillings worth of tea into the Boston Harbor. Then from there, you had the coercive acts. Now the English are not playing around. At this time, you get a quote from George III to the House of Lords, and he's telling them, okay, guys, and again, he likens us to a child, and England, Mother England, as the mother or father. And he says, basically, there are times when you reason with the child. There are times when you concede to the child. We've tried both. And he says, now we must use a more coercive measure. We must basically make them afraid. We need to strike fear into them. And he also, what's interesting is he states that he sees this as nothing but the product of rabble rousers in Boston and Boston's environs, and that if they just squeeze out and capture and hang the ringleaders around Boston, that everyone else will run and scatter. So at any rate, that's what happens here, is that then to add with the coercive acts, they closed down Boston Harbor. The councilmen, then they not only had the state level representatives dissolved earlier, right? Now, even the New England town hall meetings, right? Like the city councils were shut down as well. So now there literally are no democratic institutional bodies left in places like Massachusetts. They're giving us no voice whatsoever. So they changed their mind and they put the vice admiralty courts overseas, which was even scarier than putting them in Philadelphia and Boston. And but they gave all the British extraterritoriality, saying, right, if you engage in smuggling, we're going to make you disappear to a foreign land and be tried by English naval leaders. But when our Englishmen engaged in some act in which someone tries to take them to court, they're exonerated from having to face an American jury and an American judge. They are to be sent back to their own territory and tried by their peers in the military back in England proper. And of course, everyone interpreted that as they're not going to get punished. They're going to do as they wish, and they're just going to get a slap on the hand. And that the term to that is extraterritoriality. And then almost as a slap in the face to us, I think perhaps there was, again, a paternal aspect to it, whereby they were saying, you know what, here's what happens on the contrary when you do behave, is they issued the Quebec Act. And the Quebec Act greatly enhanced the political rights of French inhabitants of Quebec, Canada, who are now under England. And in particular, it gave them rights and freedoms as Roman Catholics, as English was Protestant under the Anglican Church. And so this was seen as a slap in the face. So on September of 1774, the First Continental Congress was convened. And at that time, Benjamin Franklin says, basically, the die is cast. We've already thrown that single dice, that die into the air. Whether it's going to be a 1 or a 6, time will tell. But in our declaration for our rights, we spoke about Enlightenment notions, the Scottish opposition notions, Christian notions connected to the Great Awakening, and allusions to classical Rome. And so, to what extent were those ideals really a part of our rebellion? I leave that up to you. So in Lexington and Concord, right, what happens now is just as the assemblymen decided to meet on their own after being dissolved in the colonies one by one, the militiamen who had been serving under their governors, right? And remember, 9 out of the 13 colonies were royal. And in those royal colonies, the governor was handpicked, and handpicked English aristocrat who handpicked his own royal council. And those two could sometimes team up on the elected assembly in each of these 9 colonies. So at any rate, when all this happened, people in the militia who were born and raised Americans fighting under their British governor had to make a choice as far as their allegiance. And so some of them chose to stay loyal, and they were known as Tories, like the conservative Tories back in England who wanted to put us in our place. And then those who broke away and began informally training and arming themselves for a war that they saw as almost inevitable at this point in time. They called themselves Minutemen, that they would be ready at a minute's notice to defend Americans' rights. So there was a rumor that Minutemen who had left the Massachusetts militia for the rebellion were congregating, training, and acquiring caches, large piles of ammunition and guns, muskets, etc. So General Thomas Gage was ordered to go and arrest them. And if there were any opposition to them, as far as anyone even pointing a gun at him and his men, he had the right to fire on sight. Well, on his way there, that's when you had the famous ride to Paul Revere. Paul Revere was caught at one time and almost killed, and was able to subsequently get back on his horse as they left him, as they were told they were getting really close to John Adams and John Hancock. And so that wasn't before he met a young man who was leaving the home of a girl he was courting, and an older doctor who was doing a doctor call at a house. He sent them in two different directions as well. And they were trying to warn the future founding fathers that were there to skedaddle out of that area and to get as much of the men, the arms and ammunition out of there before the British made it there. Well, on their way there, they were stopped at Lexington, and it was a motley group. There was one boy who was only like 13 years old. There was an older man who was like 65. And supposedly, Thomas Gage said, "For God's sake, drop your weapons." And they wouldn't. And so then there was the shot heard around the world, as they call it at Lexington. No one can fully affirmatively attest who shot first, but someone did, and both lines fired into each other. We didn't kill a single Brit, and they killed 13 of ours. But by the time they made it to Concord, most of the important leaders in arms and ammunition had been evacuated. And on his way back, on his slow, cumbersome march with his army, Thomas Gage and his men back to Boston, they were sniped, and upwards of 100 were killed by snipers. And the British were furious because that's not how a gentleman fought in the 18th century. So when they made it back to Boston, they had literally like a party. It was in the winter. I don't know if it was a Christmas party or what, but they woke up and they found some of their own confiscated cannon up atop Dorchester Heights, facing down on the city of Boston, ready to fire upon them. They were surrounded. So they put up a white flag. They evacuated. A significant portion of Boston evacuated with them. Those who didn't want to become, collateral damage in a war. Those who openly sympathized with the British and thought it was their Christian duty to stay loyal to their English, leaders. And they left, and they sailed all the way up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And of course, there was great praise and everything and happiness and all that. And George Washington stayed sober. He knew that it hadn't even begun, that all they were doing is raising more men and getting ready, and they were going to come back in quite large numbers. And that's exactly what they did. And at that time, we sent out a last olive branch petition to King George III, trying to talk sense to his stubborn parliament and asking him to remember our ties, as many of them were English in heritage, etc., and their political ties and cultural traditions that they shared, etc. And by that time, it was too little too late. George III said basically, he refused their offer. And so 30,000 British redcoats came into the islands of New York, Manhattan, Long Island, Staten Island, and then came into mainland New York and just started pummeling us. And it'd be a long, sobering war from 1775, really, to 1783, when the English are finally going to give up and let us have our own country. All right. And of course, July 2nd, they established and voted on a Declaration of Independence written by 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson. And it was pronounced and celebrated 2 days later on the 4th. And hence our 4th of July. And in it, right, the notions of human equality, you see the Enlightenment all in it. And a list of grievances against George III. So notice there was a lot of projection, not toward Parliament, but towards George III himself as the key villain of sending his men to fight his own, quote, children and shed fellow Englishmen's blood. So on number one, when you look at number one, this is an English perspective. And what happens basically in a nutshell is the English, according to number one, did not enforce their mercantilist restrictions stringently at all within North American colonists for over a century. They virtually let us do what we wanted. So hence, we were neglected, but it had a healthy, a salutary effect. So hence the term of this thesis, the title, Salutary Neglect. So you'll see examples of assemblies gaining more and more rights for themselves and for the American colonists in several colonies. Because remember, the English Constitution and common law are organic. It's a mixture of all these different institutions, Parliament, Crown, the courts, and how they make decisions from time to time. And so when decisions are made and a certain demographic gets rights by decisions by a judge, by Parliament, etc., then it's unless it's overruled in the future, right, reversed, it's now considered an acquired right that the Englishmen gained. So, for instance, you had people tried for smuggling, and there was a deal made in one of the colonies, I can't remember which one, whereby they made a deal with the governor and said, we promise if you allow us as his peers to try him as a smuggler, we promise to convict him. And they did. And what do you think they said after that? We just established a precedent. From here on out in our colony, anytime someone is indicted for smuggling, he is to be tried by his own colonists and peers in a jury, not by a British redcoat, not in a vice admiralty court overseas, by naval cadets or anything like that. And so then you have Massachusetts. They made it clear that they had to give their permission to tax. They made it clear that they could control the governor's salary and other things, as you could read in this. And so they were garnering for themselves right after right politically, right? And then economically, the customs officials, that was a hated middleman position on your way up the military ranks that no one seemed to want to do. You're far from home. You're always the bad guy playing cop and pulling people over and getting them in trouble for not having the proper papers. And you're not remunerated. You're not paid well at all. So what did a lot of the customs officials do? Some literally left their posts for months or longer and vacationed down in the Caribbean. Others took bribes on a regular basis. Said, okay, I see you don't have paperwork for this tobacco. I said, how about we give you a third of what we make in selling this tobacco if you turn a blind eye? And oftentimes that was too much to resist. And the customs official said, okay, you got a deal. So for those reasons, and probably more, the mercantilist restrictions economically were not enforced very well at all. So hence, we gained political powers by grabbing them for ourselves, mainly our assemblies, our elected assemblymen. And we economically did whatever we wanted, despite not having the proper paperwork to do so. So hence, right, when the English cracked down on us at the end of the French and Indian War, say, okay, we're going to finally start enforcing these navigation laws, mercantilist restrictions on who could do what economically. And oh, by the way, assemblies, you're not nearly as powerful as you think you are, as you have been, right? It's the idea that if you have a demographic of people who were virtually powerless at one point, and through time acquired great power, great wealth, great autonomy to do as they pleased, good luck in trying to take that back from them, because they got a taste of the good life. So that is the common English interpretation to the War for Independence, that we had a great thing going, we as Americans, and we fought simply to keep that good thing going. We weren't oppressed. We weren't fighting for basic human rights. It was about power and economic flourishing and keeping that. By the way, Ben Franklin did his homework better than I did here, number one, and he had names of specific cases in specific colonies in specific years, whereby the right was won to, like I said, have a jury of your own peers try you, of the assemblies having to give their consent to all taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So he goes through this methodical historical list, right, of different times and so forth. And think about that. That's what the English common law was about, is when you historically, gradually, right, organically, like a growing plant or organism, gain more and more rights, they become yours. That's the fluidity and the flexibility of English common law. And it was meant to be that. But it gets done with all that painstaking attention to detail, historical detail. And Parliament simply rebuffs him and said, yeah, that argument would have worked if you were here in England, but you're just colonists. So none of those, we don't identify any of those cases as precedents that we have to follow. So how do you even argue with that? It becomes a moot thing. All right, so that's number one. It's known as a salutary neglect thesis. Okay, kind of the British perspective. Then number two is court history. And this is by Bernard Bailyn. You need to know that on the test. So please remember, read all of these, even though you're just working on one. Bernard Bailyn is all about the role of beliefs and ideas and ideals in the War for Independence. He believes that it was a bona fide revolution. All right. Notice I've been playing it safe and diplomatic, and I've just been calling it the War for Independence, literally, right? For something to be revolutionary, it should be socially in the realm of culture, values, beliefs. It should be, in addition to socially, politically, with the type of political system and who's ruling, etc., and economically, the type of economic system and how it changes as far as who has access to resources and all that. That in all three realms, there should be a drastic 180-degree turn for something to be considered in many historians' eyes a true revolution. So as you can imagine, there's less controversy over the one in France. I won't get into detail. It's been a long time since I studied that as a student anyway, but you could make the argument that the French Revolution was just that. It was quite radical in all three areas, social, political, and economic. But here it's more argumentative, okay? But to Bailyn, it was a revolution. It was a revolution, especially in the social realm of beliefs and values, etc. All right. So, for instance, you have the notions coming from Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke in his Second Treatise of Government, stating the social contract. They surmised that at some point in early history, man lived in a state of nature, that it was virtual anarchy. There were no institutions, no government yet, each man for himself. We were hunting and gathering, etc. And they assumed that that was the way nature intended them to be. So in many ways, it was a good thing to be back in the state of nature. However, man being who he is, there will inevitably arise cases of people abusing their complete freedom and stomping upon the freedom of their neighbors. Some might capture you, and you've done all the work fishing and hunting, and they point a weapon at you and extort you and take all the food from you after you've done all the work, or force you to become their hunter and fisherman and enslave you, or attack you and physically harm you or kill you, etc. So they surmised that there came a time for a necessary evil, for a lesser evil, that people in the state of nature finally said, you know what, I love my freedom and I don't want to completely give it up, but I am increasingly and even more so disconcerted by my lack of security, right? So what they did is they consented, they surmised, that early generation, They gave their permission for elected reps to govern over them. But those elected reps were not to lord power over them. Those elected reps were to protect their natural freedoms, their natural rights. The government was to be their servant, not their master, in protecting their natural rights. And as soon as the government refused or failed to do so, they would oust them and elect new men and women who would. So, quote, the right of revolution also. All this is found in the Declaration of Independence, written by and summarized by Thomas Jefferson. All right. Then getting into natural rights. Well, what were some of them? Voltaire is kind of arguably the father of our First Amendment. He was an iconoclast. Iconoclast, I think of like South Park, in the name of freedom, and in the name of kind of having a leveling effect in society for equilibrium. You deliberately go after the powerful and whatever is held sacred, and you try to bash it and discredit it. All right. That's what Voltaire did to such a successful extent that he was chased out of France, his native country. He became a wanted man. But he was all about freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, okay, freedom of the press. Diderot and Condorcet, they wrote the first encyclopedias, and they stressed that all human beings are entitled to the natural right of self-cultivation, right? To try to make yourself as successful and well-rounded a person as your natural talents and efforts allow you to become. So that school should not be closed to anyone. People should have access to education, learning a trade, gaining access to land. All of that should be offered to the common people as their natural right. And remember, a civic right by the government, the argument is what the government gives, the government can take away. But a natural right, you're entitled to it. They're supposed to have to be compelled to acknowledge that you have that right and protect it. Okay. So at any rate, you had a guy named Beccaria, and he was all about the rights of suspects when they are suspected of committing a crime, because there were a lot of egregious, egregious violations of their rights, where people could just be thrown in a chateau prison and never be seen again, and never really truly even have a trial, have a chance to defend themselves and all that. So Beccaria was real big on that as a natural right. All right. Then also kind of dovetailing with them were the English and mainly Scottish liberals, known as the liberal opposition. Okay. And they, in a nutshell, were libertarians. Remember, libertarian is government, don't tread on me. You want government to be as small and unobtrusive into your personal life as possible. So, to the Scottish liberals, they wanted everyone to feel safe and free from the possible tyranny of their own government turning its armed forces against its own people and devouring its own. So they were huge on what would become our Second Amendment, the right to bear arms and protect themselves from an oppressive government. They were for, as was Montesquieu in the French Enlightenment, they were for checks and balances. They didn't trust anyone to have too much power. So they loved the idea of checks and balances, offices being elected and be held accountable by their voters, etc. Anything that limited government, written constitution guaranteeing rights. The Scottish liberals were all for that. All right. And then at this time, there were two guys named Gordon and Trenchard, Trenchard, and then Gordon is Gordon. Can't remember their first names, but they had a newspaper called Cato's Letters, Cato. Cato supposedly died to keep the Republic alive when Julius Caesar was trying to become the first dictator. Okay, so there was symbolic in the man's name that they chose for their newspaper. So in Cato's letters, what they did is they synthesized what was spreading in the French Enlightenment, what was spreading in the Scottish libertarian movement, and then they combined it with local recent news in England. And what they did so well and so kind of divisively is they showed the exact instances and ways in which King George III and his parliament were violating those beliefs and becoming a cause of concern. So you also, I have at this time amongst Scottish libertarians, stuff that almost amounts to conspiracy theories, saying, right, that when the tyrant comes, he's going to be sly. He's going to slowly take away one tradition, one right at a time, very incrementally in steps, so that people don't even really perceive it. So going back to the American War for Independence, all right, we have an intelligentsia. We have an intellectual, anomalously, which means out of the ordinary, educated elite, like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, is it James or John Dickinson, John Adams. These guys, right, had not only the finest of education, but they had leisure, right? They didn't have to work 8 to 5 daily, weekly. They had time to read this stuff that is percolating throughout Europe. All right. In fact, Benjamin Franklin and his visits to Paris, he met with Gordon and Trenchard, or at least one of them, and he made a deal and paid him to be able to get copies of their newspaper sent directly to Philadelphia so that he could print them for Americans to read also, so they could see what type of mischief the English government was up to. All right. So the notion is, yes, the average American did not have the time, did not have the education to sit and read these lengthy books by Montesquieu and Rousseau and Locke and Voltaire, etc., right? But our leading intelligentsia did. And what they did after they read them, because our leading intelligentsia could even read them before it took years to have them translated. They could read them in the French. They were conversant in French as well. And so they would read it, and then they would synthesize. They'd put all the major, kind of summarize all the major ideas that they had read from these Enlightenment and Scottish libertarian leaders, and they put them in a palatable form. Remember, palatable, it's a metaphor. It's something that you're able to put in your mouth and swallow. Okay. So they did tracts and pamphlets that would usually only be about 30 pages long, because the average person just didn't have the time and the means to read beyond that. They used very simple vernacular, because of course, when they wrote to one another, they were like Baroque. Their vocabulary, the way they phrased things was just like reading poetry. But they didn't do that for the common people, right? They did it down to their level. They made it very common sense oriented, very simply stated, in relatively short write-ups, also in speeches, etc. So they passed the word down to the other demographics of Americans, so that by the time we began fighting Mother England, the average American had become, quote, enlightened. The average American had raised his own expectations of what he thought he was entitled to and what he thought all Americans ought to be entitled to. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions on number 2? Don't be shy, or else maybe a thumb up. Hopefully you guys can all hear me still. All right. So number 2, thank you, Joey. Number 2 is romantic, right? It's court history, because it's contending that we're not an average country that was just born upon power and greed, ambition, desire for resources, etc., right? But that we truly came to believe in these lofty beliefs, and we wanted to form a separate country that carried them out and provided the rights that were inherent in those beliefs and writings to the American people. So the term that you hear often is American exceptionalism. We're exceptional, we're special, we're different in a better way. That's what you're reading in number 2. Okay? A special type of revolution. Then number 3. Now, one thing I don't like about number 3 right off the bat is I only do one guy, because I'm doing this off of one book. All right? So no matter what you think of George Washington after you read this, he was one dude. He wasn't Thomas Jefferson. He wasn't Benjamin Franklin. He wasn't John Adams. He wasn't all these other gentlemen that were founding fathers in leading the rebellion and in establishing the republic that we have years later. So it's one dude, but I'm under the assumption that if this one dude is like this, perhaps how many more other founding fathers could have been similar, which I think already is shaky ground. But nevertheless, going off this one book and this one man, I paint a picture of a very selfishly ambitious George Washington. Most of the concerns, most of the behavior, most of the quotes that you'll find in here are about himself, not about America, not about his generation, not about his country, but about himself and his own ambitions. Okay? So he tries to rise up in the military, and he gets people who are less qualified in battle than he was, in his estimation at least, who get the job instead of him because of their political connections. It was called the patronage system, Patronage. You had to have the right, you had to have the political public support or patronage of the right people, right? The right connections with them for them to choose and like you and appoint you. So he just wasn't in the in group, right? So you see evidence of that militarily. Then you see evidence of his economic ventures. And he grew, well, that was a misnomer, actually. His slaves grew. His slaves grew several things, like tobacco, wine, cotton, hemp, etc. And by the way, the hemp was for rope. But at any rate, he had to go through these hated middlemen, okay, known as consignment houses. They took however much of his stuff they thought they could sell. They took it to whatever market they deemed most beneficial. They assigned the price for his commodities that they deemed appropriate. And then they took their own cut for their efforts out of his profits before the profits, what was left, finally came back to him. Needless to say, he became so almost furious over this that he begins writing letters to English colonial leaders, hinting that he was contemplating smuggling. All right. Now, one thing that some of my students miss who choose number 3, okay? I want to make sure you catch this because I meant to convey it, and I feel like when I read it that it's in there, but maybe I'm not obvious enough. And I don't mean that condescendingly. I just mean maybe literally I'm too vague about it. But at any rate, I call this book mildly revisionist. Remember, revisionist is when you revise, you change the court romantic image of things that praises leaders, etc. So this clearly is revisionist because it's definitely showing George Washington in a negative light. All right. And it more than suggests that he was primarily a leader of the rebel army because his own selfish individual ambitions had not been met, had been thwarted. So it begs the question, well, what if he had been appointed in the military? What if he had wiser and more generous consignment houses that sold his commodities and made him better money? Would he have been a Tory? Would he have been fighting on the other side, defending the English? The author of this book thinks that that question is not beyond the scope of possibility. All right. But the mild part is to him, right? The patronage system, the mercantilist system with these consignment houses were unfair generically, not just toward him, but in general. They were unfair and they were foolish. Okay? Because he had a notion, as with the military, of what we call meritocracy. And what we're proud of with our capitalist economy today is that supposedly we are to be able to rise or fall economically based upon merit, based upon what you earn, what you deserve, what you work for, how talented you are. Okay? And he just thought it was, like I said, not only unfair, but just foolish to put these foolish leaders in military positions instead of people like him who were more qualified. When he spoke of the act to keep the Americans, the Proclamation of 1763, that kept Americans from traveling west across the Appalachians, he said he encouraged his fellow Americans to defy that law. He said that is their quest to what I call later the American dream. And that's unfair. And it's downright oppressive for the British to deprive Americans of that right to go make something of themselves in the West. And then with the consignment houses, he contended that there should be freedom in what he does with the commodities cultivated on his own plantation. He should be able to send them to whatever market he wants, decide upon his own price, and that other Americans should have that same right. That's why I call this one moderately or mildly revisionist, because some of his grievances were more universal than just his own ambitions being thwarted. He wanted a new world that was more fair, that was bent more upon the ideal of meritocracy, of everybody getting what they merit, what they earn, what they deserve. Okay? All right, and then lastly, number 4, this is Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn, okay, page 10 of his book, History of the American People. He states, for too long, histories have been written to justify the executioners He said, I'm going to show it from the point of view of those who were executed. So this guy is definitely a conflict historian. Remember that? He believes that what really drives human history and the directions in which it goes are power, competition, conflicts between different demographics. Remember, a demographic is a category of the population. And to him, right, he shows not only how some demographics have won politically, economically, socially, but he makes villains of those winners, unlike court history. He makes villains of the winners, and he tries to elicit our sympathy for those who lost, for those at the bottom of the pyramid. And then in addition to that, later on, after we gain our own republic, establish a capitalist system, his tone almost intensifies because he also was Marxist. He believed that capitalism is inherently parasitical. For someone to win, someone else has to lose. And those who are biggest, who are most endowed with capital, with money to start with, unfairly gobble up everybody else and do everything they can to maintain their domination over those beneath them. So that's important to remember when you see Howard Zinn's name. So what he does is, I hope I'm not oversimplifying what I've read of him, but at the very least, his narrative has 3 main demographics instead of 2. Up till now, we've talked about Americans and we've talked about British, right? In this war for independence. But with him, he said, no, they're developed an elite cadre of colonial, parasitical leaders. But yet they were still under the British. They were in the middle between the British and the common, poor, blue-collar workers, homeless, oppressed, marginalized, etc., beneath them. Okay? And he does an interesting job in showing evidence in more than one colony of poor American people writing letters of complaints against their own elected assemblymen. Remember that they're supposed to be their voice. They're elected reps, right? That's all they had. But instead, in more than one occasion, the people would write to the English governor, who was handpicked, not beholden to them for re-election, not born in America, did not identify with them, didn't pretend to, but they actually went to the English handpicked governor and said, you need to do something about our assemblymen. They're living like fat cats, enjoying all the plaudits of fame, being elected reps, enjoying their lucrative economic ventures with their high-ended contacts that they enjoy. And they are absolutely inattentive to our needs, our grievances, our desires, etc. As further evidence of that, when the war begins, when they establish the Continental Army, it begins trying to coerce, maybe coerce is too strong of a word, but in many ways it somewhat did, trying to coerce all the local militias from the different colonies, the different cities and areas and regions of different colonies, trying to coerce all the local militias into fighting with one central command under the Continental Army. that remained a grand task throughout the war. Okay, why is that? Howard Zinn says that the common people and the militias sensed the ambitious designs of the leaders of the Continental Army. They did not identify with them as people, demographically, being from the same class, etc. You look at the founding fathers, a lot of them had been leaders of the Continental Army or were leaders of the Continental Congresses. Before that, elected assemblymen. And they end up, by and large, overwhelmingly constituting the majority of people at the Constitutional Convention later in 1787. Over half of them, you guys, were college educated. Many of them were lawyers. Do you know how rare that was in the population? Intensely rare. So they were not a microcosm. They were not a mini example of the people they were representing. They were the upper crust. They were the elite, and they knew it. So you have this disconnect between them and their common soldiers throughout the war. Pennsylvania and New Jersey will have big mutinies during the war. They will have to resort to offering them bond certificates. Remember, that's treating them as if they had lent money to the Continental Congress and we're going to get that money back with interest. They promised them bond certificates. They promised them lands in the Ohio Valley. And they promised them money in shillings to try to almost bribe them to continue to fight for them. Then when it was deemed necessary, they cracked down on them. They had, in a few rare cases, they had public executions of some of the soldiers, some of their own. All right. So to Howard Zinn, this is evidence that the common people did not see the war for independence as their fight. He says at the beginning, they began to, with all the opposition to the taxes. They were joining the grassroots Sons of Liberty chapters, etc. But very quickly, their rebellion in the cities in particular, supposedly, okay, frightened the colonial elite, the future founding fathers. You have some telling quotes of this from John Adams, where he writes to Sam Adams and says, hey, man, you have a way with these commoners. He says, we need you to tell them not to destroy all, not to go through the neighborhoods and destroy all the nice, wealthy homes. And many of these wealthy homes belong to Americans who are for the rebel cause. You need to convince them that their enemy is the British, not us. So with Zinn, and I don't know if he's going too far with this, but he says that when these, Stamp Act mobs formed and went a little crazy at times at the beginning of altercations, that they were beginning to feel like catharsis, right? Like punching a punching bag, getting out a negative emotion, right? That the poor were almost just cathartically just wanting to fight anybody who was wealthy out of their own misery and their own poverty. But that the founding fathers hijacked the rebellion. They took it over by force and by shrewdness. And they used a combination of threatening and bribing these common people that they didn't truly identify with to fight with and for them. And they projected their anger to the British and said, the British are the reasons for your misery. They are the enemy. Let's unite and kick them out. When they're gone, we will have a country of our own where you will have more opportunities than you have now. I read in a book that George Washington assigned Nathaniel Greene over a group of men at the Battle of Brooklyn. Nathaniel Greene was not impressive to look at, supposedly not really a man's man, but more of a bookworm. But he knew his military strategy, and he was young. So he puts him in charge of a group of men. And at the Battle of Brooklyn, at Jamaica Pass, they were outflanked and humiliated and routed by the English. George Washington lost many more battles than he won. Okay, but he just outlasted the English. So at any rate, his men began to run from their trench. And he jumps in front of them and says, "No, men, you must not retreat." And one of his own men pulled a harquebus, an old Spanish pistol, to his face and fired. And thankfully it misfired, or it would have killed him. Well, word got out after the humiliation and the loss. George Washington's ego was completely wounded from the loss. And he rides right in. And he's like 6'2", 240 pounds. A big, imposing guy. He jumps off his horse and he walks right to Nathaniel Greene. He said, "Where is he?" And Nathaniel Greene goes, "Oh, no, sir, that's not necessary." He said, "I said, where is he?" He points the guy out that shot the gun at him. He grabs him by the queue, the ponytail, and thrusts him down to his knees in front of all the men. And he pulls a pistol to his head. And supposedly, Nathaniel Greene begged for the man's life, told him it was okay, he won't do it again. Please, that's not necessary. George Washington throws him to the ground, looks at the rest of the men, and says, "Next time there'll be no mercy." And then he just jumps on his horse and rides off like Clint Eastwood. So there were times in which George Washington really, and Alexander Hamilton, his aide de camp, really had a lot of elitist sentiment toward their own soldiers as being untrained. Because remember, he had chosen that as his career, to rise up the military chain. So he had the proper training and all that. And there were times in which he showed almost utter disgust toward a lot of his rank and file soldiers for their lack of discipline, their lack of willpower, them losing heart, them getting furloughs and not ever coming back. Plenty of that happened. And by the way, John Adams likened the analogy in the Bible with the angels and the devil's rebellion against God. He said, like that, a third of the Americans openly rebelled against England. A third of them stayed loyal to Mother England as Tories. And a third of them seemed to not care, be indifferent, or just want to take care of their own families and make sure they weren't harmed, and didn't really participate on either side. And that hasn't really been refuted, that characterization of the population. So we were anything but like a monolithic group of everybody being united from all classes, all ethnicities and ages, uniting in our fight against Mother England. All right. And so, yeah. So in the war, we did better when we fought guerrilla warfare style. Remember, guerra is war in Spanish, so guerrilla is little war. So fight them when it's advantageous for us, hit their supply lines. The Marquis de Lafayette, and as I mentioned, Nathaniel Greene were really adept at that and helped us with that, because in most of the major battles of confrontation, we lost to the English. And the French became a vital ally to us under Louis XVI, the same guy that's going to die in the French Revolution years later, thanks to Saratoga. At Saratoga, we were just very fortunate. There was a guy, Lord Germain, who was in charge of choosing the allocation of troops here, British troops to fight our rebellion. And there was a guy named Henry Clinton who was next up in line as far as his pedigree and connections with family, his years of service, how high of an official he'd become in the armed forces and all that. He was supposed to have been the shoe-in, but instead Lord Germain chose Johnny Burgoyne. Johnny Burgoyne was a lot younger, and critics contended that he was chosen because Lord Germain was homosexual and Johnny Burgoyne was very handsome, very pretty man. So Clinton refused to help at a vital time. Henry Clinton refused to come to the aid of Johnny Burgoyne because of his anger over Burgoyne getting the job that he felt that he should have had. And then you also had Thomas Howe. Thomas Howe was in Philadelphia. He got himself an American girlfriend, and he received a very vague letter from Lord Germain saying, you may want to go help Burgoyne. And he didn't interpret it as a command, so he didn't. So Burgoyne was left on his own with well over 10,000 soldiers. And he was trying to make it to Albany, and they were going to encircle the New England colonies, as mentioned earlier, thinking that if they just killed the ringleaders of New England, everything else would die out. But we also had espionage, and our guys were waiting and set him up in a trap at Saratoga. He fought valiantly for a couple months, and then he had to surrender. And it was right at the time when Louis XVI of France was telling his visitor, Benjamin Franklin, if your army could show me that it can win a major victory, then I'll venture with my troops to help you. So when Burgoyne surrendered over 10,000 men in one day, Louis XVI was supposedly convinced by the surrender at Saratoga to use French soldiers. At Yorktown, where it all ended, there were 3 French soldiers for every singular Continental Army soldier. And what supposedly convinced Cornwallis to surrender is they'd asked him twice before, and he kind of smugly demurred and said don't worry about him. He said he had his forces coming. And after the second time, the French diplomat said, are you referring to St. Eustatius in the Caribbean? And supposedly he just grew ghastly white, because that's exactly what he was referring to. The French Navy surrounded St. Eustatius and kept them landlocked and kept them from coming and bringing the ammunition and the men that he needed. And back in Parliament, they literally had fistfights in Parliament over this. Some people even liken it to that we were England's Vietnam. So it was becoming clear that the Tories did not hold the numbers in Parliament to continue to send more boys over here to possibly die when the casualties mounted. It was an unpopular war back in England. So when Cornwallis surrendered, they decided to call it quits. They already had their hands on East India. They thought it was more important and more lucrative. They had their hands on Barbados, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, and the sugar planting islands of the Caribbean. And so they just made a choice to stop fighting. So really it was a war of attrition. We didn't really defeat the English. We just outlasted them. We kept fighting until they quit. All right. So any questions over anything? Do you guys feel like you learned anything? Thank you. Joey. Right. Okay, guys. So I'm going to go ahead and call it a day and hope to see you on Wednesday, okay? You guys hang in there. Keep turning these in. And please remember, you're only doing one at a time, but read all of them. It will greatly help you on the test, the subsequent test. All right? All right, thank you. Sandro, thank you. Shania, thank you. You guys have a great night. Hang in there.